difficult part of that transition?
I think for Trevor, the most difficult part of coming home was that Paul was not on the airplane. Trevor is a uniquely strong individual. He actually landed in remarkable mental health. And I think part of it is Trevor was good and angry about his wrongful detention, and that anger and sort of the desire to resist his captors kept him going. So he hit the ground running. Obviously, he was emaciated. Some folks, when they come home, have difficulty sleeping in a bed, for instance, because they've been kept in concrete. I've had people, they're not Trevor, who've been kept in darkness, that have to keep the shades in a room, down for quite some time as they adjust to being back in the light. It also, there's a media circus, and it's natural. It's actually a good thing for the issue that folks are covering this. But for the prisoners, when they first get out, it's pretty intimidating and overwhelming in a good way. But I'm hoping Paul seems to be like Trevor in the sense that I've heard his conversations with CNN when they've been aired. And, he seems to be in great mental health. I'm looking forward to hearing what he has to say in particular.
And he's been there held for 5 years, of course, also accused of espionage. And we are just hearing, Jonathan, from the Wall Street Journal, they are reporting that Paul Whelan is also among the free prisoners alongside Evan Gershkovich. Paul Whelan, of course, sentenced to 16 years in jail at a penal colony, poor conditions there as well. Talk us through what it might be like for Paul, especially the last couple of years, him seeing other prisoners exchanged, brought home. Brittany Griner, Trevor Reed. We spoke about this, what Trevor Reed was feeling because he knew Paul Whelan was still there. Talk about what his mental state must have been like there in Russia as he saw this progress being made, but he wasn't able to come home until now.
I can't even imagine what it was like for him to be passed over. And, there was a point at which 2 separate administrations had left Paul Whelan behind 3 times. So I'm delighted. It makes it particularly sweet to see him in this particular deal. He's been gone way too long. He comes from a wonderful family. Paul has lost a lot, including his dog, Flora. He's spoken quite eloquently about that. His parents are elderly. And he was concerned about getting to see them again. He spoke to reporters about that. So I'm thrilled he's going to get to see his elderly parents. I wish we could have gotten him home in time to see his dog. But I can't wait to meet him. He sounds like a fascinating guy.
Are you in touch with the other teams that are working, for instance, with Paul Whelan, Evan Gershkovich, and the others that that are being released? Is this a community of individuals working to get these hostages home? Are you been in communication with them at all?
I am in communication with a lot of these families, so the Whelans have represented themselves and done it well.
Let's join the network for more on that prison swap. Here's Whit Johnson.
I'm Whit Johnson in New York. We're coming back on the air with breaking news, a multinational prisoner exchange involving the U.S. and Russia, one of the largest prisoner swaps since the end of the Cold War. We're talking about decades here. ABC News has learned former U.S. Marine Paul Whelan and Wall Street Journal reporter Evan Gershkovich are being released. Just 2 weeks ago, Gershkovich was sentenced to 16 years in prison for espionage during what the U.S. called a sham trial. You'll remember Whelan was also convicted of spying, which he has strongly denied. He was arrested in December of 2018. The U.S. has tried to include him in other prisoner swaps, including the release of WNBA star Brittany Griner, only to be rejected by Moscow. President Biden has made winning the release of detained Americans in Russia a top priority since taking office. And again, these details just coming in. Let's get right to ABC's chief White House correspondent, Mary Bruce. We know it's a fluid situation, Mary, but what are you learning now?
Well, Whit, this is the largest and most complex prisoner exchange since the end of the Cold War. This has taken months of detailed, painstaking negotiations. The president himself deeply involved in these conversations. We are told that he has been monitoring this in near real time throughout this morning. I am also told that the president this morning here in the Oval Office gathered the families of the Americans that are being released today. He wanted to give that news to them himself. They are, as you mentioned, of course, Wall Street Journal reporter Evan Gershkovich. He has been held since March of 2023. He was just sentenced last month to 16 years in a penal colony in that secret trial that had absolutely no public proof. Also, former U.S. Marine Paul Whelan, he has been held for 5.5 years, also on similar espionage charges that the U.S. and Whelan and Gershkovich have all fiercely denied. Also being released, Alsu Kurmasheva. She's a Russian-American journalist who has been held for nearly a year, and Vladimir Kara-Murza. He's a Pulitzer Prize-winning Washington Post columnist, a prominent Kremlin critic. We are told all 4 of them are now making their way back home. All told, 16 individuals held in Russia will be freed, and 8 individuals held by the U.S., Germany, Norway, Slovenia, and Poland will also be returned to Russia. Turkey also playing a logistical role here. This is the culmination, we are told, of many complex rounds of negotiations. This ultimately went up to the president having detailed negotiations himself, leader to leader. It became very clear several months ago that Russia was not going to be willing to engage in any kind of prisoner exchange without the release, excuse me one here as I read through my notes, without the release of Vadim Krasikov. He, of course, is a Russian operative, a convicted murderer, and he is being held, or was being held, in Germany. That meant that the president had to get on the phone and actually reach out to the German chancellor. The president's so involved, what we are told, that he was actually making calls on this in the hour before he decided to drop out of the presidential race. And I do want to let you know one other update that was just handed to me here. The president is going to be coming before cameras in a little over 20 minutes at noon to deliver remarks on the freeing of the Americans detained in Russia.
All right, Mary Bruce, stand by for us. We know those details still coming in right now. And you mentioned Turkey. Let's go ahead. I believe we have a shot from the airport in Ankara. We don't have that anymore, but we know that intelligence agency there, officials were telling us that they played a coordinating role between the countries, and that likely that tarmac at the airport was a place where this prisoner swap was going to happen. Again, we had some pictures coming in. We're going to stay on top of that. Let's bring in Tom Sufi Burrage, who's been following the developments overseas. And Tom, Mary mentioned Vadim Krasikov. Of course, he was serving that life sentence in Germany for gunning down a Kremlin opponent in Berlin. That was back in 2019. Now, Putin himself, through a series of a number of interviews, had suggested that any prisoner swap needed to include him. What more are you learning?
Yeah, no, we know Vadim Krasikov was absolutely key to this deal taking place. Vladimir Putin saying so himself, and U.S. officials confirming that. Vadim Krasikov, as you say, gunned down a Chechen dissident in a park just over there here in Berlin 5 years ago. He was serving a life sentence here in a German prison, and he is one of the key people to be returned to Russia. Also an individual from Norway, also from an individual from Poland, and critically and fascinatingly, a Russian couple being held in Slovenia. Yesterday, all of a sudden, that couple pleading guilty to espionage charges in a Slovenian court. According to Slovenian officials, they were leading a double life with an Argentinian fake identity. Their kids also returned in this prisoner swap.
All right, Tom, thank you. Let's bring in Martha Raddatz, our chief global affairs correspondent, who's joining us on the phone right now. And Martha, what does this say, the fact that the U.S. and Russia can negotiate successfully under difficult terms like this?
Well, I think, first of all, this is very separate from any relationship we have with Russia. Things are obviously still incredibly tense because of Ukraine especially, but this is an incredibly good sign that they can still cooperate on matters like this. What I think one question is why Putin did this now. He obviously felt very strongly about getting Krasnikov back, especially the assassin. And I think when you go into that kind of job in Russia, you are almost promised that they will do everything possible to get you out, and they can certainly recruit more after that. But as we know, Joe Biden has been working on this for a very long time, and his team, to try to get Evan Gershkovich and Paul Whelan back. The families have also been so critical and so key in all of this. They did not let anyone forget that Evan and Paul and the others, and there was always talk of the others, we want everyone released possibly, but the families and the Wall Street Journal, certainly for Evan, just kept the focus on these prisoners and said they would do absolutely anything so people did not forget that they were held so long. So the family's certainly celebrating this morning the soon-to-be arrival of their family members with.
Yeah, just an agonizing wait for these families as these negotiations played out behind the scenes. Martha, thank you. Let's go back to Mary Bruce at the White House as you're getting more detail, because, Mary, you talked about how President Biden himself had been involved. These negotiations were going on behind the scenes. Obviously, there was that high-profile prisoner swap with Brittany Griner a while back. And then there was a setback after the death of Alexei Navalny. There was some question as to whether he could be involved in a swap going forward. What else can you tell us about how we got to this point today and the president's involvement?
Well, what we are actually now hearing from the president, he has just put out a paper statement saying the deal that secured their freedom was a feat of diplomacy. He said some of these men and women have been unjustly held for years, saying all have endured unimaginable suffering and uncertainty. The president saying today their agony is over. He goes on to thank all of the allies who were involved in this, saying this is a powerful example of how vital it is to have friends in the world who you can trust and depend on. And then he goes on with a strong message to those who are still being wrongfully detained, saying, let me be clear, I will not stop working until every American wrongfully detained or held hostage around the world is reunited with their family. He says, even as we are now celebrating the return of these Americans, he says that his message to all of those still being detained and their families, we see you. We are with you.
Mary Bruce and our entire team, thank you. Once again, President Biden expected to make some remarks on this. The prisoner swap, unprecedented. We haven't seen anything like this since the end of the Cold War. When that happens, we will break back in. But for now, our coverage continues on ABC News Live and abcnews.com. We'll have a full wrap-up on world news tonight. So for now, we'll send you back to regular programming. And in some parts of the country, that's Good Morning America. I'm Wade Johnson in New York. Have a great day.
This has been a special report from ABC News.
You're watching ABC News Live, special coverage of breaking news. Evan Gershkovich and former U.S. Marine Paul Whelan are now free after being detained in Russia. A senior Biden administration official tells ABC News Russia has agreed to a multi-country swap between 6 nations involving 24 prisoners. President Biden is expected to address the nation shortly. I want to bring in ABC's Elizabeth Schulze, who is on the phone. She is at the White House for more on this. Elizabeth, what is the latest there? We know the president just put out a statement.
Right, that's right, Stephanie. The president has just put out a statement saying that 3 American citizens and 1 American green card holder were released. Of course, we know that those are Evan Gershkovich, the Wall Street Journal journalist who has been in Russia, wrongfully detained for more than a year, Paul Whelan, a former Marine who was there for more than 5 years, and 2 others. The president says that this is a deal that secured their freedom and feat of diplomacy. We know that the president, Stephanie, was personally involved in this. He says that today their agony is over. He is grateful to our allies, he says, who stood with us through this tough and complex negotiations that we are told took the place over several months, with the president directly involved with U.S. allies, including Germany, Poland, Slovenia, Norway, and Turkey. He says this is an example of why it's vital to have allies who you can trust and depend on, and that this is what now we can say that these Americans will be home safe, Stephanie.
Home soon. ABC's Patrick Reevell is also with us. Patrick, what are you hearing from the Wall Street Journal right now? What are they saying about their colleague, Evan Gershkovich?
Hi, Stephanie. Yeah, I mean, this is a huge moment for all of Evan's colleagues at the Wall Street Journal, but also his many friends and colleagues who worked with him in Moscow. Evan was known very well within the press community in Moscow. He's known as a very committed journalist, a very brilliant journalist. And of course, it's just a wonderful thing for them to see those words that they've been pushing for a year, to see Evan Gershkovich is free. That's a big, big moment for them, of course. I mean, Evan's arrest also had a profound impact on how we've been covering Russia. His arrest meant that people no longer were willing to be in Russia. You know, most foreign journalists left Russia when it invaded Ukraine back in 2022. Evan, though, continued to go very bravely because he was committed to covering Russia and believing that it was vital that people understood Russia during the war. And so he continued to go. He was on a reporting trip when he was arrested in Yekaterinburg back in the start of 2023. And since then, of course, he's been held in Russian detention. He was then sentenced very, very rapidly in that trial, which honestly gave the first hint that perhaps there was a prisoner exchange coming, because it was just so extraordinarily short. But I think also for people now, while they're celebrating seeing those words, until they see him back on American soil, that will be when the real celebration begins.
Absolutely. We, of course, are still waiting for those images. Chief White House correspondent Mary Bruce is at the White House. And Mary, we've been talking about this all morning long. Obviously, a fluid situation, a very complex situation. What are we learning about the intense negotiations it took to get here?
This was months, if not years, of detailed, painstaking negotiations. This is the largest and most complex prisoner swap since the end of the Cold War. It involves many of our allies. This is a seven-nation agreement here that came together to get this done. And as Elizabeth was saying, this involved also directly the president himself. It became very clear to the White House that Russia was not going to be willing to negotiate without the release of Vadim Krasikov, the convicted Russian murderer who is being held in Germany. That meant that the president had to negotiate with the Germans, and the president did just that, actually working the phones, getting on the phone with the German chancellor. We are told that the president's level of involvement was so much so that actually on the day that Joe Biden announced that he was no longer seeking re-election, he was also working the phones to try and get this deal across the finish line. It is a historic moment in this country. It is certainly a day for celebrating across this country and here at the White House. We do, of course, expect the president to come before cameras shortly and explain for himself this remarkable moment. And we do know that he met this morning with the families of the Americans who are now coming home. The president wanting to give them the news himself in the Oval Office, Stephanie.
Those families, I'm sure, are very elated and excited to see their loved ones finally. ABC News contributor and former Homeland Security official Elizabeth Newman also joins us. Elizabeth, how significant is this? The largest prisoner exchange since the height of the Cold War. What could that mean for U.S.-Russia relations?
Well, certainly not to dampen the excitement of a great day like this and getting our people home. I don't know that this indicates that we're going to see a better, more friendly Russia. Russia has exhibited extremely provocative and hostile behavior over the past decade in particular. Ukraine is one example of that, but it is certainly not the only example. They just in the last week did some flyovers with China, incurring into our airspace up near Alaska. They continue to try to be putting pretty devastating types of weapons up into space, at least they're attempting to. The indications are Putin is intending to be pretty provocative and hostile moving forward. So it's a great day. I'm very grateful that Putin was able to return some of these prisoners that he wrongfully detained. But I don't think we should look at this as a sign that Putin has a change of heart, or that Putin is going to change his approach on the world stage. We still have a pretty difficult actor who's causing lots of damage and harm in many places across the globe.
And these prisoners held for quite some time there. Elizabeth, thank you. Jonathan Franks has worked with several families of detained Americans. And Jonathan, you were on an off-the-record call this morning about this exchange with the White House. What can you tell us about that? I was actually not on the call, but I have been talking with people that I work with. And you have a readout of that call, is that right? I have some insight into what was said on that call. We'll take whatever we can get. And, you know, it seems to me that this is, when they say it's the biggest deal since the end of the Cold War, I mean, I think there's probably about a dozen Germans in this deal as well. So it's not just the Americans. The complexity of this thing was just huge. And to see, I think it's important that they appear to have cleared the decks of the journalists that were in Russian custody. And I think that's really important, because taking a journalist hostage is only one small step less outrageous than taking a diplomat. I want to bring in ABC's Patrick Greville, who has been in contact with friends and family members of the detained Americans throughout this entire ordeal. What have they been telling you, Patrick? I'm sure they're relieved that this is finally happening, but throughout this process, what have they shared with you?
Hi, Stephanie. Yeah, I mean, people are really starting to celebrate now since they've seen those words. Evan Gershkovich is freed, and the belief now as well, as Jonathan was saying, that so many others have been released, including Paul Whelan, whose ordeal in particular has been so long. I remember Paul being arrested back in 2018. He was sentenced to 16 years in a labor camp. I remember speaking to him by phone from that camp back in 2020, and him describing the conditions there, saying that they were Dickensian, saying that he was sleeping in bunks with about 50 other men, and he's been there just so long. And of course, the most difficult part often has been that he has missed out on some of the other prisoner exchanges that have gone forward in the past, which is just, you know, heartbreaking for a family to watch. So throughout this, I think one of the things is also just the immense weight, which Jonathan knows very well, that lies on the families because of this absolute understanding that they must do something, but not really having any of the power to do it, except for trying to persuade governments to go through with these exchanges. It's immensely difficult, and it's appalling weight that just weighs on people every single day, where they wake up thinking, how can I get my loved one out? And so this is a huge, wonderful moment for them, which will end it. I think they'll still be waiting to see them in person. And of course, it's not simple once the person gets out, particularly for someone who's spent a long time in detention. There's a lot for them to process, for them to get back to normal life. So this will also just be the beginning for them. But of course, it's great news for all of those being released. Stephanie.
Absolutely. This release, a long time in the making, Patrick. Elizabeth Schulze at the White House, as we wait for President Biden's remarks on this exchange at the top of the hour, what more can you tell us about who exactly was involved in this exchange?
So, Stephanie, we know that all told, 16 individuals who were held in Russia will be freed, and then 8 individuals held by the United States, Germany, Norway, Slovenia, and Poland will be returned to Russia. Among those who will be freed, who are coming back to the United States, of course, Evan Gershkovich, the Wall Street Journal reporter who had been held unlawfully detained in Russia since March 2023. Former U.S. Marine Paul Whelan, who had been held for 5.5 years on espionage charges that the U.S. has denied. Also, Kurmasheva, who is a Russian-American journalist held for nearly a year, and Vladimir Kara-Murza, who is the Pulitzer Prize-winning Washington Post columnist and prominent Kremlin critic. Stephanie, these are incredibly high-profile names who the U.S. says has been wrongfully detained in Russia, some of them for many years. We know that the president was personally involved in the negotiations to try to bring bring these Americans home. In fact, we know that the president also met with the families of some of these Americans here at the White House this morning. As you say, we are awaiting remarks from the president scheduled for noon today. He's expected to talk about what really is a historic day. As Mary has been reporting, this is the biggest prisoner exchange since the Cold War. This is a 24 total prisoner exchange, and it took months of painstaking back and forth negotiations with President Biden directly talking to allies and counterparts to try to get this done.
A massive exchange indeed. I want to turn to Elizabeth Newman. You've discussed this morning, how this is basically Russia's MO, detain an American and then use it as leverage. So talk us through what exactly Russia is getting in return for this swap.
So it appears, we now know from reporting that he is getting a person named Krasikov back as part of this exchange. This is an individual that's a known assassin. And I think it was our own Martha Raddatz on the news special that made this very particularly important point that when you go into that line of business in Russia, there's a bit of a commitment to those highly trained individuals that we will take care of you if you get arrested. Like, we will be loyal to you and make sure that you don't suffer the consequences that most of the world would suggest are very justifiable, that an assassin who kills citizens across the globe, should be held to account, should be put in prison. So he's getting those folks back. And look, he has an agenda here. There's a reason he wants those people back now. He's still prosecuting a war in Ukraine. He is increasingly cozying up to North Korea and to China. We know from both reporting that they make public, as well as some reporting that has been made public from U.S. intelligence sources that he is intending to kind of try to rebuild a Soviet Union or a Russian empire, and he wants to do that through hostile actions, and he needs these bad actors in order to be able to carry out his aims. So there's definitely some sort of extreme value to Putin that he was finally in his place where he would release so many prisoners. He wants the people that he's getting back so that he can continue his agenda of evil perpetrated across the globe.
And Elizabeth, as we heard from Mary Bruce, she said that this is a process that likely took months, years to work out. How do administration officials work with allies and the international community to negotiate exchanges like this?
Yes, it is a painstaking process, and it sounds like this particular process has unfurled pretty intensely over the past few months, that perhaps the death of Navalny actually made some complications in that process, but maybe also created some pathways that hadn't been there before. I'm sure over the next 24 hours, we're going to hear more about those painstaking negotiations, but multiple countries are involved, Germany being a key one, but also countries like Turkey and Slovenia. These are countries that likely had their own needs, their own leverage points, things that they needed to get out of the negotiations. And sometimes those negotiations involve reassurances from the United States that we will provide you with things that you might need in order for you to release the prisoner that Russia wants. So there's usually a lot of tactical details, but then eventually, and we are starting to see the reporting, eventually you are moving up the ladder to the Secretary Blinken's and the President Biden's getting on the phone and having that heart-to-heart saying, let's find a way to make this happen. Let's find a way to free our people, even though it's a very difficult decision to let bad actors go, people that have caused death and destruction and, no shortage of pain for the communities that they have impacted. It's a hard decision to let those bad actors go. And so it does kind of require not just the tactical details that the negotiators probably work through, but that senior leadership to come along and really kind of agree that in principle, it is important for us to secure the freedom of people that are wrongfully detained, and let's make this happen.
Absolutely. And Elizabeth, we're watching a live picture now of the White House. We're waiting for President Biden to make remarks here off the top of the hour. Patrick, if you're still with us, we are learning new details from Turkish intelligence. What can you tell us about that? What are they saying?
Hi, Stephanie. Yeah, Turkish intelligence has put out a statement, and they say they played a key role in coordinating this huge prisoner exchange that they say involved 26 people. They're giving some of the details that confirm some of the things that we had been hearing and that we have been seeing some indications of around who might have been traded for Paul Whelan and Evan Gershkovich, as well as these other political prisoners that were being held in Russia. In particular, they name one man called Rico Krieger, who is a German citizen who was being held in Belarus, the key ally of Russia, of Vladimir Putin. Just yesterday, he was abruptly pardoned after being sentenced to death, supposedly for helping Ukraine. That was a clear indication that potentially he was going to be part of this exchange. The belief is that German citizens had to be involved because ultimately one of the key people that Vladimir Putin has said he wanted for this exchange was a man called Vadim Krasikov, who we've been talking about. He's this man who was convicted of being a Russian an assassin for the FSB in Germany. He was convicted of killing a Kremlin opponent in Berlin. And so the belief was that some German citizens would have to be traded in order to try and make it more palatable for Germany, giving up someone who was very dangerous in order ultimately to try and release other citizens, in particular American citizens. We're also, I should say, we've been watching for the last few hours planes on the tarmac in Turkey's capital, Ankara. We've been seeing a Russian government plane that flew there and was suspected to be potentially involved in this exchange, to be carrying some of the prisoners. We're now watching that still sitting on the tarmac, and a number of jets have pulled up alongside it. The belief is that that is where the exchange is taking place, and that it's taking place on the tarmac there. Stephanie.
Thank you very much, Patrick. I want to go ahead and read a statement put out by the family of Paul Whelan, the former U.S. Marine that was being held there in Russia for about 5.5 years. The family spokesperson putting out a statement saying Paul was a Russian hostage for 2,043 days. would imagine they were counting down the days until his return. The statement goes on to say, thanks for covering Paul's story and helping us share our messages and advocacy for his release over that time. Paul will be receiving U.S. government support, as all freed hostages do in the next few days and weeks. I hope you will give him some privacy as you have done with other released hostages. The statement goes on to say, the spokesperson says that his work as the family spokesperson is now over. Jonathan Franks here, who has worked with representing many hostage families, including the family of Trevor Reed. As we look at this statement, how does that sit with you? This is a moment they have been waiting for, as they note in the statement, 2,043 days. That's how long Paul Whelan was in that Russian jail, and now he is finally free. What do you think they're going through right now?
You know, I think they're probably a little bit dazed, overjoyed. That's listening to that brought a little tear to my eye, because the Whelans are actually who asked me to represent Trevor Reed back in the day. So I feel like they've had a huge impact on my life, not that it's about me, but to see Paul and to hear from them finally, you know, a confirmation statement. As you can see, I'm smiling from ear to ear.
Yeah, very, very joyous moment. I want to reset the stage here. We are watching, you are watching ABC News Live special coverage of breaking news. We are watching Evan Gershkovich and former U.S. Marine Paul Whelan as they are now free after being detained in Russia. A senior Biden administration official tells ABC News Russia has agreed to a multi-country swap between 6 nations involving 24 prisoners. President Biden is expected to address the nation shortly. ABC's Patrick Reevell has been covering these detained Americans since the very beginning. We've been checking in with him throughout the morning. We want to check in with ABC News contributor and former Homeland Security official Elizabeth Newman. Elizabeth, we have been speaking about this all morning long. This is so significant, but detail for us how significant this multi-country swap really is for this country here in the U.S.
Look, this hasn't happened at this size and scale since the Cold War. And even think about the fact that we're referencing the Cold War. Here we are 30 years later. And that moment in the 1980s, we were on the precipice of some form of detente, and we were trying to, eventually would see the breakdown of the Soviet Union, and that's the moment. In around 1985, when we last had this massive prisoner swap. So on one hand, it should set the context for us, like, we have that many prisoners to swap amongst our allies in Russia that it takes us going back to the Cold War and the Soviet Union to have a parallel. So that's not great. It's not great that that's how chilled our relations are, how damaging Russia's behavior has been on the world stage. What I don't know, I'm not seeing any indications that we can take this as a moment of potentially future détente with Russia. In fact, it seems that the reason they want these Russian dissidents or Russian prisoners that the ally countries, including the U.S., were holding, the reason they want them back is because they plan to continue to be a bad actor on the world stage. Russia has been extremely aggressive, not just Ukraine. It's in their provocative way that they are engaging with China and with North Korea, sending weapons, dangerous weapons into space, restocking weapons that in previous treaties they said they wouldn't. So they have indicated that they're trying to rebuild a Russian empire, and in Putin's vision of this world, it requires being hostile. It requires being very provocative. You remember a couple of years ago, we had them deploying very dangerous weapons on British soil to kill dissidents. Radioactive material was being used. It was also used on Navalny. I mean, they are a bad actor, and increasingly getting more aggressive and provocative. in their bad actions. So unfortunately, I don't think this moment is a moment of a change in our relations with Russia, that Russia is changing their behavior. And yet we are still extremely grateful that we can have those hostages, those people that have been wrongfully detained in Russia, have them back. And so we find ourselves kind of in this space of the tension, knowing that they're probably not going to change their bad behavior. We should expect that Russia is going to continue to wrongfully detain people. We should expect that they are going to look for future leverage points so that they can get their bad actors out of prisons when we arrest their spies or their assassins. So unfortunately, it's a good news story, but it's also a challenging space because they're likely not to change their behavior. And by the way, we still have American citizens that are being wrongfully detained by Russia. And I know we've seen from Secretary Blinken's statement that they are still actively trying to bring those people home. So perhaps if there's any glimmer of hope about the future, it's that, okay, we've been able to do this one prisoner exchange. Maybe in the not too distant future, we can get more people home.
Exactly. How will that help the other prisoners that are still being unjustly kept in those jails? Elizabeth, thank you. Jonathan, we know that Secretary of State Antony Blinken says in a statement, we are grateful for the support we had from a number of our allies who made this deal possible. He goes on to say his pledge to the families of those still separated from their families is the same that he made to those returning home today. He says, we will not forget you and we will not rest until you see your loved ones again. You are working with some of those families. So what do you make of that statement and what hope does that give you to get those other prisoners back home?
First of all, I believe him entirely. Secretary Blinken has been a godsend to this issue. I remember sitting on a conference call with him when he was about 12 days into the job, as he, spent hours on the phone talking to all the hostage families. We had a lot more back then. And they've since cleaned out our ranks very nicely. So there are fewer and fewer people wrongfully detained each day. As far as the folks that are still separated from their families, I would like to see the government take a more aggressive approach designating folks as wrongfully detained. I think sometimes we're defining wrongfully detained so narrowly that it doesn't make a lot of sense to me. So I'd like to see a broader definition of wrongfully detained and the Levinson Act applied a little bit more broadly.
And your work with the families who have loved ones overseas, you mentioned the number. If you could share that with us again, and also where do you go from here with this happening today, knowing that these 4 individuals and others, a total of 24 prisoners being released, going to their different countries, the U.S., Germany, and so forth. Where do you go from here in your work to get prisoners back home?
That's a great question. I mean, we still have a raft of folks in China. We still have a case in the Bring Our Families Home Campaign Coalition from UAE, Zach Shaheen. So, unfortunately, this is a business that's sort of a whack-a-mole. There's always somebody else to help. I'm working with a group of a cluster of about 15 American veterans that are stuck in Kuwait on what I believe are falsified drug charges. So there's always more work to do.
And Jonathan, we commend you for the work that you do and for continuing to do this type of work. We know it is not easy. We met a few years ago as Trevor Reed was coming home. Wonderful to see you today and speaking about another group of Americans coming home. Thank you for your time, Jonathan. Do want to mention Vice President Harris has commented on the release of these individuals. She says, today we celebrate the release of Paul, Evan, Alsu, Vladimir, and others who were unjustly held in Russia. It gives me great comfort to know that their horrible ordeal is over and that they will soon be reunited with their families. The President of the United States and I will not stop working until every American who is wrongfully detained or held hostage is brought home. Want to check back in with Elizabeth Newman. Some critics have voiced concerns about the Biden administration agreeing to these exchanges, saying it could encourage Putin to detain more Americans. You've spoken to this, saying that Putin has used these detained Americans as leverage. This is his MO. So if you could break that down for us just a bit, and also what's at stake here for the U.S. as we continue to see these types of prisoner swaps.
in a dilemma, right? It's a dilemma when you're doing hostage negotiations, whether you're negotiating with a foreign country or other hostile actors. You know, there was always this line that we don't negotiate with terrorists. And obviously, when you're the president of a country, you're not formally a terrorist group, but certainly Putin's behavior at times is indicative of, in fact, they have sponsored acts of terrorism. So there's an aspect here of it's a plausible critique. Like, are we actually feeding the beast by doing this prisoner swap, making it more likely that they are going to actually go and unlawfully detain more people so that they have bargaining chips so that we will in the future release whoever we might arrest that is important to Putin. And I think that's, you know, that is always a struggle when you are doing these negotiations of recognizing that you are creating an incentive structure. And I don't know that I've heard a plausible argument that the alternative is like, no, we're not going to negotiate at all. We're just going to let these people die in a Russian prison. That's not how we take care of our citizens. Like, one of the most important things that a government has as its job is to protect its own citizens. And we do that through a variety of means, including law enforcement means at home, military abroad. But in the case when a citizen is captured or unlawfully detained, we find ways to rescue them. That is our obligation as a government. And so sometimes the way that we rescue them is through these prisoner swaps. And yes, there is kind of an underside here that isn't great. But I also don't know that there are too many other solutions here. So while it's kind of one of those things that always comes up after a prisoner swap. Are we creating an incentive structure? I also kind of think it's an easy thing to do when you are on the sidelines, when you are not actually in the room doing the negotiating, or you're not actually responsible for bringing that citizen home. So you tend to hear it more from legislators who, look, it's their job to provide oversight. It's their job to critique and make suggestions of how we can do things better, but they're also not in the executive branch actually responsible for doing the work. And sometimes there's that great Teddy Roosevelt quote about the man in the arena versus those that are in the stands. It's really easy to be on the side in the stands, you know, making your critiques of how something should have been better. But until you actually get into the arena and do the fight, you don't actually appreciate how difficult these decisions are. So it is a pretty stereotypical critique. It's also one in which nobody has ever come up with a plausible alternative to meet our obligation to take care of our American citizens that are unlawfully detained or worse, are in hostage situations.
I'm sure the families and colleagues of those individuals who are being released are thankful for those conversations and for being able to come to some sort of an agreement. I want to bring in Shannon Crawford, who covers the State Department for us. Shannon, what does this mean for U.S. relations with Russia? What have you heard lately being there at the State Department?
Well, Stephanie, officials are cautioning us not to view this as a sea change moment in the relationship between the U.S. and Russia because things are still incredibly tense. There's, of course, the war in Ukraine, and there's U.S. opposition to the Russian judicial system that allowed these Americans to be wrongfully detained in the first place. So they say the Biden administration's policy, that's going to stay the same for now. Now, what this really does speak to, actually, is the strong relationship with U.S. allies that were necessary to make this swap possible.
And I want to bring in Elizabeth again. Elizabeth Schulze at the White House. We will check in with her in just a bit. Want to check in with Elizabeth Newman. What are you watching for as President Biden is set to speak shortly?
You know, I think this is a unique opportunity for President Biden after a very difficult month where he made the hard decision to not continue his bid for a second term in office, to demonstrate that he still is capable of performing the duties of president, not only capable, but doing it quite well. If you remember when he was brought in as Obama's vice presidential nominee, it was often discussed that it was his foreign policy credentials, that he was this senior statesman, and that he knew how to operate on the world stage. And we had a glimpse of this at the NATO summit earlier this month, this relationship that he has with foreign leaders and being very well respected on the world stage. And now we're actually seeing the fruit of that. It's not just that he shakes hands and takes pictures with world leaders. He actually got something done because of those relationships. And you don't always have moments in a presidency to be able to demonstrate on the world stage how those relationships, how being perceived by your colleagues of other presidents, other prime ministers, that actually matters. Most of that stuff happens behind closed doors, or it's not as sensational as a prisoner swap. It's a treaty that gets signed, that or a trade deal that gets signed, and the American public probably doesn't pay that much attention to treaties and trade deals. But here we have an example where.
Thank you, Elizabeth. I'm sorry to interrupt. We're going to join the network for more on this prisoner swap. Here's Whit Johnson.
We're coming back on the air because President Biden is about to address the nation over this historic multinational prisoner exchange now unfolding. The president calling the deal, quote, a feat of diplomacy. ABC News has learned former U.S. Marine Paul Whelan and Wall Street Journal reporter Evan Gershkovich are being released as part of a 24-person swap involving the U.S., Russia, Germany, Norway, Poland, and Slovenia. 16 prisoners are being turned over by Russia in exchange for 8 prisoners held in the U.S. and other countries. The exchange taking place at the airport in Ankara, Turkey. In a statement, the Wall Street Journal saying Evan is free and on his way home. Also saying it is a joyous day for Evan's family, friends, and colleagues. Gershkovich, you'll remember, was sentenced to 16 years in prison for espionage during what the U.S. called a sham trial. Whelan was also convicted of spying, which he has strongly denied. He was arrested in December back in 2018. President Biden has made winning the release of detained Americans in Russia a top priority since taking office. And we know that President Biden has met with the families of Whelan and Gershkovich. We are waiting right now. You can see the podium there all set up for President Biden to come and make these statements. But while we do wait, let's go back to ABC's chief White House correspondent, Mary Bruce. And Mary, we do expect, or at least we know, that President Biden was meeting with some of the families. What do we expect to see here in the coming moments?
We were told that the president this morning gathered the families of those Americans who are now on their way home, wanting to tell them the news himself this morning in the Oval Office. This is something that the president and this administration have been working on for months, years. This took detailed, painstaking negotiations and is now a historic deal. This is the largest, most complex prisoner exchange since the end of the Cold War. The president himself getting directly involved at points, having conversations leader to leader. We are even told that on the very day that the president announced he was not seeking re-election, as the president was recovering from COVID, he was working the phones trying to get this deal done. I suspect you will hear him celebrate this moment not only as a remarkable moment in American diplomacy, but also as a moment to really celebrate the importance of these relationships that the U.S. has with our allies to come together and secure this kind of a deal. I suspect he will also, again, reiterate his tireless work and continued work to try and bring home all Americans who continue to be wrongfully detained in Russia and around the world. But this is certainly a moment to pause here today at this administration and celebrate this remarkable moment in history. And certainly, what a moment for these families who have spent so much time working, advocating, working behind the scenes with this administration, hoping and praying that they would one day be able to have this moment with.
Absolutely. And a prisoner exchange that we haven't seen the likes of in decades, going back to the end of the Cold War. Also, while we wait for the president here, just more on this statement saying that the 3 American citizens, this from President Biden, and 1 American green card holder who were unjustly imprisoned in Russia are finally coming home. We were watching some of the images coming out of Ankara, Turkey. We saw some of the planes coming in. It was unclear exactly which plane was holding the prisoners, but up to 7 countries involved in this exchange. This is some of the video that we saw from earlier today. And an important reminder here, Evan Gershkovich, 32 years old, he'd been in custody for a year and a half, Whelan for nearly 6 years. Here comes President Biden, and you can see some of those family members, as we expected, right behind him. Listen in.
You got everybody? Well, good afternoon. And this is a very good afternoon. A very good afternoon. Today we're bringing home Paul, Evan, Alsu, Vladimir. 3 American citizens and 1 American green card holder. All 4 have been imprisoned unjustly in Russia. Paul for nearly 6 years. Vladimir since 2022. Evan since March of 2023. And Alsu since October of 2023. Russian authorities arrested them, convicted them in show trials, and sentenced them to long prison terms with absolutely no legitimate reason whatsoever, none. Paul, a former Marine, was in Russia for a wedding. Evan, a journalist with a Russian, in Russia, was in Russia, assigned by the Wall Street Journal. Alsu, also a journalist, was in Russia to see family. All 3 falsely accused of being spies. And Vladimir was a Russian citizen by birth and holds an American green card. He's a Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist and was a pallbearer at my friend John McCain's funeral with me. He spoke out against Putin's regime. And for that, he was convicted of treason. And now, their brutal ordeal is over, and they're free. Moments ago, the families and I were able to speak to them on the telephone from the Oval Office. They're out of Russia. Earlier today, they were flown to Turkey, and soon they'll be wheels up on their way home to see their families. This is an incredible relief for all the family members gathered here. It's relief to the friends and colleagues all across the country who've been praying for this day for a long time. The deal that made this possible was a feat of diplomacy and friendship. Friendship. Multiple countries helped get this done. They joined the difficult, complex negotiations at my request. And I personally thank them all again. I've thanked them personally, and I'll thank them again. All told, Russia has released 16 prisoners. 8 Russians who are being held in the West will be sent home as well. These 16 prisoners from Russia that Russia has released include 4 Americans, 5 Germans, 7 Russian citizens who are political prisoners in their own country. One of those Russians runs a human rights organization, Memorial, which won a Nobel Prize in 2022. Putin threw him in prison for voicing opposition to the war in Ukraine. 4 others work with Alexei Navalny, political opposition leader who died in Russia prison this year. Now they can live safely abroad and continue their work of advocating for democracy if they so choose. This deal would not have been made possible without our allies. Germany, Poland, Slovenia, Norway, and Turkey, they all stepped up, and they stood with us. They stood with us. And they made bold and brave decisions, released prisoners being held in their countries who are justifiably being held, and provided logistical support to get the Americans home. So for anyone who questions whether allies matter, they do. They matter. And today is a powerful example of why it's vital to have friends in this world. Friends you can trust, work with, and depend upon, especially on matters of great consequence and sensitivity like this. Our alliances make our people safer, and we began to see that again today. Let me say this. It says a lot about the United States that we work relentlessly to free Americans who are unjustly held around the world. It also says a lot about us that this deal includes the release of Russian political prisoners. They stood up for democracy and human rights. Their own leaders threw them in prison. The United States helped secure their release as well. That's who we are in the United States. We stand for freedom, for liberty, for justice, not only for our own people, but for others as well. And that's why all Americans can take pride in what we've achieved today. I want to thank everyone in my administration who helped make this happen. Our work did not start just on day one. It started before day one. During the transition, I instructed our national security team to dig into all the cases of hostages being wrongfully detained, which were inherently, well, we inherited them from the prior administration. I wanted to make sure we hit the ground running, and we did. As of today, my administration has brought home over 70 Americans who were wrongfully detained and held hostage abroad. many since before I took office. Additionally, I issued an executive order in 2022 authorizing penalties like sanctions and travel bans on those who hold Americans against their will. And my State Department has introduced new warnings for Americans about the risk of being wrongfully detained by a foreign government. Deals like this one come with tough calls, and there are never any guarantees. But there's nothing that matters more to me than protecting Americans at home and abroad. And so we'll continue to work for the release of all wrongfully detained Americans around the world. Let me end where I began, with Paul, Evan, and also Vladimir and their families. They never gave up hope. We can't imagine what they've been through, all of you. Matter of fact, this lady right here, I think, was living in the Oval Office with us for a while. All kidding aside, can't imagine their joy right now. They're home. Tomorrow's a big day. The 13th birthday of Miriam. Miriam, where are you? Come here. You all know we have a tradition in the Biden family. We sing happy birthday on any birthday. You ready? All of you. Happy birthday to you. Happy birthday to you. Happy birthday, dear Miriam. Happy birthday to you. Remember, no serious guys till you're 30. God love you. She's Al Sue's daughter. Now she gets to celebrate with her mom. That's what this is all about. Families able to be together again, like they should have been all along. So I want to thank you again to everyone who did their part. In just a few hours, we'll welcome home our fellow Americans. We're looking forward to that. God willing, we're going to be out at Andrews and get that done. So thank you, thank you, thank you. And this is a good day.
What did you say to them on the phone, sir? What did you say when they answered the phone on the other side?
I said, welcome almost home.
Countries, these so-called abductor states, from simply taking more Americans in order to get more of their prisoners held? How do you end these perverse incentives, sir?
Or advising people not to go certain places. Tell them what's at risk, what's at stake.
What's the of these negotiations, and can you speak to the complexities of working with 6 countries to secure these releases?
Well, look, I'm not going to take the time now, but I'll do this later in the week. I particularly owe a great sense of gratitude to the Chancellor. The demands they're making of me required me to get some significant concessions from Germany, which they originally concluded they could not do because of the person in question. But everybody stepped up. Poland stepped up, Slovenia stepped up, Turkey stepped up. And it matters to have relationships. It really does. These things matter. Pardon me?
Could this improve relations with Russia? Is there any avenue for that after this prisoner exchange deal?
As my sister might say, your lips to God's ears, man.
Did you ever speak with Vladimir Putin about this? Or would you be willing to speak with Putin now directly?
I don't need to speak with Putin. Anyway.
How did you weigh that decision of letting somebody out who sounds like got away with murder?
I got home innocent people. Thank you. All right. Thank you.
President Biden making those remarks from the White House.
Say that again?
Are you speaking with President Erdogan, one of the leaders about this?
Yes, I've spoken to all the leaders about this.
What did you say about you?
And by the way, as a father, look, you heard me say this before. I mean it. My dad had a simple proposition. Family is the beginning, the middle, and the end. Blood of my blood, bone of my bone. I can think of nothing more consequential. I mean it sincerely. And having lost family, not a different way, and not knowing what's happening, the circumstance when they're accidental, health, it matters.
Mr. President, what did Germany ask for in response for their cooperation?
Nothing.
President Biden,
What did Chancellor Scholz say?
President Trump has said repeatedly that he could have gotten the hostages out without giving anything in exchange. What do you say to that? What do you say to President Trump now? former president.
Why didn't he do it when he's president?
Sir, what did you
Okay, forgive me for the interruption earlier. President Biden sometimes has a tendency to walk away from the microphone, then walk back to it to answer some questions there. But as you saw, the president joined by the family members of those 4 Americans who are now coming home. That included the family of Paul Whelan, Evan Gershkovich. And also you saw there that moment, the daughter of Alsu Kermosheva, the president asking everyone in the room to sing her happy birthday, her mother now coming home after this historic prisoner exchange. Let's go back to our chief White House correspondent, Mary Bruce, because, Mary, there are a number of things that the president outlined here and very much highlighting the feat of diplomacy and friendship, touting the importance of our allies and good relationships around the world.
With the president stressing this is why allies matter. The president working very closely with those other countries to get this across the finish line. And the president recognizing, look, these were bold decisions, difficult decisions to bring these people home. Of course, 16 individuals held in Russia are now being freed. The president noting some of them are Russian political prisoners. Russia, in exchange, then releasing 8 individuals that were held by the U.S., Germany, Norway, Slovenia, and Poland. But it is really remarkable, the president saying that this speaks to the importance of diplomacy and friendship. Of course, there at the end, he was asked about the fact that Donald Trump has claimed that he could have done this without, releasing anyone in exchange. And he, said there pointedly, well, then why didn't he do it? But the president stating very bluntly what is true, that this is a good day. He said that he was able to get on the phone in the Oval Office with the families as they were finally able to speak to their loved ones as they are now returning home. The president's message to them, a simple one: welcome almost home.
Mary Bruce, thank you. Let's bring in Tom Soufi-Burrage, who is following this from overseas. And Tom, we mentioned the unprecedented nature of this, the largest prisoner swap since the Cold War, 24 people at least involved. And we know one of them, a Russian who is being held in Germany, accused of murdering someone on the streets there, an accused assassin. There will be questions moving forward about whether or not this was an even exchange, and does this only encourage Russia to take more Americans into custody to use as leverage pieces for negotiations going forward?
Yeah, and I think U.S. officials today have told us, look, difficult decisions had to be made. There was a trade-off here. Yes, 16 individuals were released from Russian prisons, but 8 had to come out of European and American prisons, including 3 out of U.S. custody, including the son of a Russian lawmaker involved in a mass fraud scheme, also a Russian businessman involved in a $93 million scheme to hack into American corporations for his own profit, and also a Russian intelligence officer, we're now hearing fascinating details. This individual was accused and convicted of tapping into supplying potentially sensitive American electronic hardware and ammunition, which Russia potentially was going to use for its war in Ukraine. So there is a trade-off. And yes, the key individual was Vadim Krasikov. He's been held here in Germany. He assassinated a Chechen rebel in broad daylight 5 years ago in a park just over there in Berlin. And he was the key individual that Vladimir Putin wanted out. It had to happen. The White House U.S. officials saying it was not an easy thing to convince the Germans, and that's why you're seeing a significant number. 5 of the 16 are German citizens that have been freed today.
Tom Soufi-Burrage, thank you. And we know for the families involved, this has been an agonizing wait as these negotiations played out behind the scenes. We want to play a clip of an interview from back in March. Our George Stephanopoulos spoke with Evan Gershkovich's family about the 1-year anniversary from the time that he was taken into custody. Let's listen.
What's the first thing you're going to do when he comes home?
I don't even know. I just wouldn't let him out anywhere for several days at least.
Well, that is what they were hoping for months ago, and that is what's going to happen as these Americans make their way back home. ABC's Patrick Reevell is joining us now. Patrick, I know you've been in touch with the family members, with friends and colleagues. What are you hearing from them today?
Yeah, I mean, this is just such an extraordinary and wonderful moment, obviously, for the families. As President Biden said, ultimately, this is about families and reuniting them, seeing the relatives there on stage. I saw the sister of Paul Whelan was standing on the stage there, Elizabeth. I know from meeting her over the years just how much she has lobbied, how hard she's lobbied to get her brother home over this appalling ordeal that lasted 5 years. We also saw, of course, the parents there of Evan standing with the president. This is a moment that they've been dreaming of. You know, I think it's important to say Evan was very well known to the media community in Moscow. When I knew him personally there, when I was working there, he had many friends among the journalists there. He was known as an incredibly committed journalist, someone who believed that it was crucial that the world understand Russia during the war in Ukraine. He chose to go back there, even though most Western journalists had decided it was too dangerous to go there after the war. He paid a terrible, unjust price going there and being arrested on a reporting trip. And Paul Whelan as well, you know, I remember covering his arrest all the way back in 2018. And then in 2020, I spoke to him from a prison camp there where he described the conditions, saying, you know, it was Dickensian, that he was trapped on bunks. There are just many other prisoners in this former gulag. So it's just a huge moment. We've also got a statement from the Whelan family, from his twin brother David, who for many years has just been putting out statements almost weekly, trying to update people on Paul's conditions. Finally, he's saying he is free. He's saying now that they want privacy, that Paul will receive support from the US government, as other hostages have in the past. And that is what we've seen previously when Brittany Griner was freed, when Trevor Reed was freed. They underwent counseling at a military base down in Texas. They were given support with counseling. But, you know, I think much of the celebrations will only begin once these people are back on American soil.
And Patrick, that's why there was so much anxiety this morning when we were getting reports of this possible exchange, but the family's holding on tight, wanting to make sure that this actually went through and was successful with everyone safe. Patrick, thank you so much. We do also have a statement here from Vice President Kamala Harris, now the presumptive Democratic nominee. She writes in part, "It gives me great comfort to know that their horrible ordeal is over and that they will soon be reunited with their families." Also echoing President Biden here, saying that the president and I will not stop working until every American who is wrongfully detained or held hostage is brought home. Let's bring in our chief global affairs correspondent, Martha Raddatz, who's joining us on the phone right now. And Martha, what does this mean for U.S. and Russia relations, the big picture here going forward? Because there's also a question about possible talks about Ukraine and some of the next steps there.
Well, you heard President Biden himself criticize Russia right away. So I don't see a lot changing with Russia. This is just on a completely different track, these kinds of negotiations. You heard the president say these were show trials. There was no legitimate reason to hold these people. All three were falsely accused of being spies. But for President Biden, you have to know that after these last few months, after stepping aside in this election, after the debate, after the interviews he did, this has to be a highlight for him and his administration, and to show the power of diplomacy and the work they have done with allies. Sure, he will be criticized. The administration will be criticized for what was traded. But President Biden made the point again and again that our alliances make people safer. He said this says a lot about the United States, that we work to free not only Americans, but those Russian political prisoners. This really was a surprise to everyone, especially the release of Evan Gershkovich so quickly after he'd been sentenced to 16 years. But I think when you look back, there were some clues there. His defense attorney wrapped up things very quickly, and Russia has not released people they accused of being a spy until they are convicted. I am also thinking and listening to Patrick especially about knowing these people who are been released. This is a very difficult transition. There, of course, is great joy for the family, great joy for Evan and Paul and the others. But we look back on Brittany Griner, it was a very difficult transition. You start to remember what you've been through, and I don't think we know the half of what they have been through.
Yeah, Gershkovich has been there for almost a year and a half. Whelan for nearly 6 years in those prison camps. Martha Raddatz for us, thank you so much. We truly appreciate it, and our entire team. Our coverage continues throughout the day on ABC News Live and abcnews.com. We'll have a full wrap-up on world news tonight. For now, we'll send you back to regular programming. I'm Wade Johnson in New York. Have a great day.
This has been a special report from ABC News.
You're watching ABC News Live, special coverage of breaking news. President Biden says 3 American citizens and an American green card holder are coming home after being wrongfully detained in Russia. The president says Wall Street Journal reporter Evan Gershkovich, former Marine Paul Whelan, Russian-American journalist Alsu Kurmasheva, and Pulitzer Prize-winning columnist Vladimir Kara-Murza are out of Russia and were able to speak with their families on the phone earlier today. He called this exchange a feat of diplomacy and friendship between multiple countries, saying they joined difficult and complex negotiations. He says today is a powerful example of why it is vital to have friends you can trust, work with, and depend on. For more on this, I want to bring in Chief White House Correspondent Mary Bruce. Mary, we saw there from the president calling the swap a feat of diplomacy and friendship. Again, talking about his allies and just how important allies are in this process. What are you learning there?
Stephanie, the president is arguing that this shows not just the importance, but the power of diplomacy, the importance of having and maintaining these key friendships and allies, that it is only because the president and this administration were able to work closely with these other countries that we are now today seeing this remarkable, historic deal come to fruition, and that these 4 Americans are now on their way back home. The president noting that he was directly involved with these leaders. The president reflecting there, especially on the relationship that he has with the German chancellor. We know that one of Russia's demands here was the release of Vadim Krasikov, who is a convicted murderer, but someone who Vladimir Putin has insisted, be brought home. And the president there saying that these kind of deals involve difficult, hard decisions, but defending them because, saying this is what is necessary to bring home these Americans. Of course, the president vowing that he will not rest until all Americans who are being wrongfully detained are able to be brought home. But Stephanie, the president there point blank saying what I think we can all agree with, that this is a very good day, certainly a good day for these families who we know have now been able to speak briefly on the phone with their loved ones as they are now making the journey back home. And the president there saying that, God willing, he hopes to be there tonight at Andrews Air Force Base when they first step back onto U.S. soil. Stephanie.
We can only imagine it was an agonizing wait for those families involved, and likely thrilled that their loved ones are coming back home. Foreign correspondent Tom Soufi-Burridge joins us now. Tom, what more can you tell us about who exactly was involved in this swap and who Russia is getting in return? Mary mentioned it briefly, but break that down for us, if you wouldn't mind.
Yeah, exactly, Stephanie. I mean, Mary mentioned that acknowledgement from U.S. officials that difficult decisions had to be made. And, we're getting some fascinating details now from U.S. officials on the 3 Russians released from U.S. custody. That's the 3 of the 8, the other 5 from European custody. For example, the son of a Russian lawmaker who was serving a 27-year prison sentence for his role in a $50 million cyber fraud ring. Another Russian businessman with ties to the Kremlin serving a 9-year prison sentence for his role in a $93 million scheme to hack into American corporations so he could make money on the stock exchange. And a Russian intelligence operative charged in a scheme to provide sensitive American-made electronics and ammunition to further Russia's war in Ukraine. So, there were trade-offs. Clearly, I mean, this is a deal. This is a very complicated deal. Multiple countries, very high-profile figures, not only in the spy world on the Russian side. We mentioned Vadim Krasikov. Mary mentioned him. He was the key figure. But actually, on the other side, some of the figures coming out of Russian prisons, we've got the Americans. Massive moment for them, for their families, for the U.S., for the Biden administration. But actually, beyond that, if you look at that list of 16, there are some very, very big names in terms of the remaining alive political dissidents, Russian political dissidents, those people willing, the few people willing in Russia to actually stand up to the increasingly autocratic regime of Vladimir Putin since the war in Ukraine began and actually speak out. And many of those were charged for, false information relating to the war, or treason, and some big names of those still alive, because we know, the biggest Russian dissidents in recent years, Alexei Navalny, Boris Nemtsov, have died or been killed in Russian custody or on the streets of Moscow. The remaining alive ones, they're getting out and they are moving to the West.
And it'll be good to see those live images once that reunion happens, those individuals reunited with their families again. ABC News contributor and former Homeland Security official Elizabeth Newman joins me now. Our thanks to Tom. Elizabeth, President Biden stressed the importance of working with other countries to make this happen. What goes into all of this behind the scenes as the U.S. worked with allies to make this exchange possible?
I mean, this really is a remarkable multilateral effort. We have been told that Germany, Norway, Poland, Slovenia were all involved. Of course, Turkey was also involved in facilitating the actual transfer where the planes landed and they swapped the prisoners. And look, that doesn't happen in a moment. You don't just call somebody that you don't have a relationship with and say, hey, can we put together this deal? You have to have strong relational ties, and not just government to government at the bureaucratic level. It also requires strong personal ties of the elected leadership, of the presidents, of the secretaries of states, and all the way down to those assistant secretary level roles. And it takes time to build those strong relationships, to build trust. And certainly one of the things that the Biden administration is benefiting from, kind of a silver lining, if you will, is the crisis in Ukraine rallied Europe and NATO and the United States in ways that we have not seen since the Cold War. There is such strong relations right now among these allies, such that you can come together and do hard things. But I think we heard President Biden say quite clearly, you can't just turn that on a dime. Those relationships take decades to build and to build that trust. And there's an active conversation right now happening in our country, whether we need those alliances, whether diplomacy really matters, if we can just withdraw and be isolated. And I think what we heard today from the president is it is to our detriment, to our risk, if we withdraw. So a great moment to see on the world stage the importance of diplomacy.
Absolutely. The president highlighting the importance of allies around the world and that friendship, that testament to that relationship seen over the last couple of weeks and months while these negotiations were taking place. Thank you very much, Elizabeth. ABC's Patrick Greville, who has been covering these Americans detained in Russia since the beginning, joins me now. Patrick, what does this moment mean to these families? We can imagine that they are elated, that they are about to see their loved ones. They've finally been able to speak to their loved ones and hear that they are on their way home. But you've been in touch with these families. What have they shared with you?
Yes, Stephanie. I mean, of course, it's just an enormous, wonderful moment for all of these families, with so many people being released. There are, of course, so many family members now having this moment. And, you know, as President Biden said, that's what this is about. It's about reuniting people with their loved ones. We saw, standing with the president there, the parents and sister of Evan Gershkovich. We saw also the wife and children of Vladimir Kara-Murza, the Russian dissident. And we also saw the sister of Paul Whelan, who I've met over the years and who I know has put so much endless effort into trying to lobby to have him brought home. And that's the case with most of these families, because it's an appalling burden that they have to bear, where they wake up every morning and think, how do I get my loved one out of Russian prison, which is an unimaginable task to have. And so all of these families, though, have been trying to take that on. They've been lobbying continuously. And I should say as well, you know, Evan was well known among the journalist community in Moscow. When I worked there, I knew him, and almost everyone there knew him well. He was known as an incredibly committed and passionate journalist who believed that it was vital that people had a good understanding of Russia at this time, particularly with the war in Ukraine. Most foreign journalists left Russia after Russia invaded in 2022 because they believed it was too dangerous. But Evan believed it was important to keep going, and he kept taking those risks going because he believed it was vital that people understood Russia. He paid a terrible and unjust price for that. He was arrested while on a reporting trip. And so, of course, it's wonderful for his family now to know that he's being freed. Of course, though, it's also not the end. Once people arrive, they're probably going to receive some type of support from the US government. Paul Whelan's twin brother has just released a statement saying that Paul will be receiving support from the US government. Normally in these situations, what we see is people are taken to a US military base base. The last time with Trevor Reed and with Brittany Griner, they were taken to San Antonio, and they were there basically given support from counselors who specialize in dealing with people who've undergone long-term detention. And so there is a long road ahead. I mean, people have to adapt, particularly people who have spent a very long time in detention. But still, this is obviously just the moment that for months and months and years, in some cases, people have been waiting for.
Absolutely, and they have a long road ahead as they get back and transition to their life here back in the U.S. Patrick Greville, thank you very much. Our thanks as well to Mary Bruce, Elizabeth Newman, and Tom Sufi Burge. Thank you all. I want to bring in Democratic Congressman Bill Keating of Massachusetts for more on this. Congressman, you've had private communication with Paul Whelan's family throughout his detainment in Russia. I want to get your reaction to this news.
Well, it's extraordinary. You know, the scope of this, but the fact it's actually happening. You know, working with particularly Paul Whelan's sister, who's in my district, coming to know her as a friend, but seeing what she went through, every birthday that he wasn't home, every anniversary of the 5 years in captivity, those are tough days. The days when Paul would say he was assaulted by another prisoner, the days where even his reading glasses were taken away so he couldn't even spend time that he had by himself with his mind. What he went through was so inhuman, so unnecessary. And if anyone could ever have a family that responded the way the Whelan family, and they're not alone. I've worked with 5 of the people that released today with their families. Yevgenia Kara-Murza was my guest at the State of the Union this year. She didn't know, particularly after what happened to Alexei Navalny, his close friend, what could happen to him, whether she would ever see him alive again. So how do you put that into words? How do you sum up what they've been through? You can't. But all I know is this: today is a day of pure joy for all those families. And I think it should be celebrated by all Americans, because if we mean anything as a country, it's days like this that we realize that we're in this together. And I just want to thank, too, as well as the people involved, Ambassador Carstens, day in and day out, was focused on this. I know. I was in constant contact with himself and Steve Gillen, people that took this to heart in the State Department. The president, who took this to heart and is now had the joyous time of meeting with the families in the White House, a day they had just longed for so long. And the countries that were involved in my role in foreign affairs, dealing with Germany. We dealt with German officials on this, Slovenia, Poland, Norway, and Turkey, helping with logistics. These are all coming together globally, nationally, but most importantly for those families, daughters and sons that never knew whether they would see their loved ones again, parents who experienced something that no parent should have to experience. So it's a day looking back of the anguish they went through, what they felt. They somehow kept persevering. And I think if there's one word to sum this up, it's the perseverance of this family, all of these families coming together, the perseverance of our State Department officials working together. There's no science to this. People think there's this intricate negotiation, there's a formula. There's no formula for these releases. They're all individual. They're all in uncharted territory. There's so many false hopes that have been dashed in this process. I've had the roller coaster, but nothing the way the family has experienced the roller coaster of thinking they were close and finding out they weren't. And I'm sure they were feeling that again in the last 24 hours. Will this happen this time? Until they see their loved ones home, they won't feel that. So today should be a day of national unity, of celebration in ourselves as a country, and just a hope that someday we have families like this, because they were there. They were there through thick and thin. And I think that maybe these prisoners who shouldn't have been imprisoned in the first place and the cruelty they were subjected to, I'm sure what got them through was that supportive family.
Absolutely. Cruelty and just horrible conditions from what we've heard. clearly an incredible effort was made by the administration, by allies, to get these individuals back home. Were you able to speak with Paul Whelan during his detainment? I know you've had communications with his family, but were you able to have conversations with Paul Whelan at all?
I put my number out there. It's up to the Russians whether they had connected. They didn't in my case. I'm banned in Russia anyways. But I have been able to correspond with him, and I had correspondence back from Paul. You know, he knew people were there. And Elizabeth in particular, who I dealt with the most, said it was so important for him to realize that so many other people outside his family were paying attention, cared about it, wanted him to get back, and he was not forgotten. So beyond the everyday pressures that he put up with, you know, when he had some physical problems that he wondered whether to be attended to, when there was, in these Russian prisons, tuberculosis, COVID was spreading everywhere. There were a lot of things to worry about. Paul was assaulted by another prisoner physically. So all these things, day in and day out, put enormous pressure, not on his family, but let's not forget on the people being held prisoner themselves. They went through so much, not knowing whether they would die in prison the way Alexei Navalny died in prison. So I hope that when they're back, they're going to get the full resources of our government to help them medically and help them deal with a huge adjustment back to the country that I'm sure they love and have greater appreciation for after their captivity. But I hope that this is a day of unity and healing and joy. And there will be days coming forward when they'll be able to spend their own birthdays, their own parents' anniversaries, Christmas, things that we take for granted every day, that were days marked by these families of complete torture themselves and uncertainty. And now they'll be able to celebrate those days together again. And things that we take for granted every day, I'm sure, will have special meaning to those families.
Absolutely. Those individuals, like Paul Whelan, Evan Gershkovich, and their families, thrilled, I'm sure, to finally be reunited. It'll be a transition. There'll be a transitional period, of course. Hopefully they get the support that they all need to adjust to a new life. Congressman Bill Keating, thank you so much for your time and for your insights. We, of course, will continue here on ABC News Live following this breaking news on the prisoner exchange throughout the day. We'll be right back.